So this talk is called io.js and the future of server-side JavaScript, but we'll soon see why it's really Node.js and the future of server-side JavaScript. But like Sergey said, it's really more about, no clicker, okay. Open source, and the future of server-side or not server-side JavaScript. Thank you. So what is io.js anyway? I don't know how many of you heard about it, but io.js is a drop-in replacement for Node that works on all your Node projects. It's compatible with nearly all the modules on NPM, but more than that, io.js is an open governance, open source project. It was started by the primary contributors in Node.js, like Trev Norris and Michael and all these great people. And it attracted more developers in the first few months than Node had in its entire history, which is pretty amazing on its own. Now, before we go any further, I want to point out that recently, like a month ago, the technical committee in io.js voted, and Node.js and io.js are merging. So pretty much everything I'm saying today, I'm saying to all of you, everything who is using Node.js anywhere, even if it's in your build, this is all relevant to you too. So let's just talk about ES 2015 features that work in io.js today. These are features you can use right now. No transpilers, runs directly on V8 on Google's JavaScript engine. So these are things probably most of you know, so I'll go through them quickly. This is a very common problem. Who here knows the closure loop problem in JavaScript? Yeah, so pretty much like most people here, everyone who's done JavaScript with asynchronous stuff and event emitters knows that this will log clients.length for every I. So in io.js, we already have ES 2015 let statements. And then there's constants, which are live today. We already use them internally. And there's maps and sets, which are really nice. They're proper collections that let you store objects in maps and sets. And it works beautifully. We use it also internally. There's weak collections, which are really useful. They're kind of hard to explain quickly. But what they let you do is basically keep data about an object without interfering with garbage collection. Like in this example, you have this external library you have to use, and it returns an object, and you want to keep data about it. But if you use an array or a regular map, it will store it, and it will interfere with garbage collection, which is a shame. So we have that in io.js. We're using it today, and you can use it in your code too. Generators, which Douglas said he thinks are not so useful. I think they're really useful. They let you write, basically there's this trick with yield. It's getting additional syntax in ES 2016 with async await, but until then you can yield actions. Generators are an abstraction over collections, and you can use them as over a collection of actions, which is really nice. They give you really, really nice syntax. And there's a bunch of other stuff. There's template strings, which if you want to see an awesome use of template strings, Mark Miller has this really nice example using an entire parser built around template strings. There's the new iteration protocol, which fixes a lot of stuff, and promises, which I'll talk about later, and are basically an asynchronous primitive that's part of the language now. So let's talk about io.js principles for a second. It's open governance. This means everything is done in the open. I don't want to go into the depths of what an open governance model is, but it's really interesting. And it's inclusive. If you ever wanted to contribute to Node or wanted to see how things are done, io.js will actually encourage you to do this. People will help you. They'll talk to you. And it iterates fast. Right now, we're keeping in sync with V8, the Chrome JavaScript engine. And there's current discussion about how in sync we have to keep with it. But this means you're getting new JavaScript features as they land in V8. Everything you can use in Chrome, you can use in io.js pretty much, and this is really nice. But why do we even want to fork Node? So the thing is, there was a lot of stagnation with the model it worked until the fork. There was a single company that owned the thing, and that was not a lot of fun. It's not that company ownership per se is a bad thing, but having a single company dictate stuff had a lot of bad implications. There was a feeling of stagnation. I don't know how many of you remember how Node was when it started in 0.2, 0.4, and so on. It moved really fast, and now in 0.10, it was moving really slow. There was a year and a half between releases, which was ridiculous. And it's a great success. If you look at io.js, at the contribution graph, This is Node.js in red, and this is io.js in green, and it attracted more core commits per month than Node had in its entire history over a time span. This is really impressive. Now, like I said before, Node and IO are merging, which is a win for the community. It's a major win for us. It means everything that went into IO we can use in our applications. And it took a lot of very delicate politics, and a big props for Michael and all the other people there who worked really hard on it. It's a big win for the community. Everything from IO is going to land in Node. So let's stop with IO for a second and talk about what open source is anyway. So in very broad terms, open source means that the source is open. It means you can access the code, you can modify it, you can fork it, you can create your own, distribute it. But let's talk about what open source is in JavaScript. In JavaScript, open source is more than just I have access to the source. We have this whole community aspect about open source. We're in convention right now about JavaScript. There are a lot of people who love JavaScript, who write code in it, and there's a big community feeling in writing open source projects. You can see this in IO, you can see this in projects like Angular, that are really community projects. People are coming and joining the projects and helping. It's a really great feeling, and it's more than just open source in JavaScript is more than just open code. It's an open community. So a lot of people have this misconception about what a contribution is to open source software. A lot of people are like, if you write this very big library, you are a contributor to open source, and otherwise you're not really helping anything. So obviously, if you're writing pull requests to big libraries or even small ones, this is a very important contribution. You're helping the world become a better place, at least for the people who believe in the ideology of the library. If you're writing documentation, I don't know how many of you realize how big of a help this is. If you take a project that's poorly documented, and you write a few lines that explain how to do something, or even in your blog, it doesn't even have to be the official documentation. It's immensely helpful. A lot of projects rise and fall on the documentation, on how easy they are to start using. Linus Torvalds even once said the reason he's not using Debian on his home computer is because it was too hard to install. So really, documentation, make easy documentation, write some. If you're opening issues about bugs, we have statistics at Bluebird about how many people see issues versus how many of them open bugs. We have these really nifty error messages where you can click on them and get all the information you need about how to solve the error. And some of them just say, well, if you got this far, open an issue. And a lot of people get there, but very few people actually open issues. So if you're opening issues is a huge help. It's a very big help in open source projects, and even feature requests. If you have a feature request, you're like, Node is stupid. Why does it do X and not Y? This is bullshit. Why? This library is not working correctly. These people will listen. A lot of people will actually want to hear about your ideas. Your ideas are very important to the library authors. If you're answering questions on Stack Overflow, if you're participating in Gitter and in other chats, this is a huge help for the community. It's a huge help for open source projects. A lot of people got started with Node or Angular or React or any other framework library because they were able to get help with what they needed to get started, and actively became contributors later. Trying the beta branch. Even if you install Chrome Canary, this is a big contribution to the Chromium project. It's how they get to test stuff. If you go to IO and download the release candidate branch and try it out, we'll really appreciate it. It's a big help to authors. So everyone who does this, thank you. This is a huge help. It's helping us all. Continue doing this. It's awesome. Don't be scared. Now, I don't know how many of you know what ES-Discuss is. It's like a language mailing list about ECMAScript. I probably made an idiot out of myself there more than most people. So I'd come there, I'd ask a question, and then Ben and I would come and say, like, Google it or something. But so I made a fool out of myself a lot of times in the mailing list. But I also got a lot of very interesting discussions. So do that. If you want to make an idiot out of yourself and ask something you think is obvious, I don't know if Discuss is the place, but ask people. Don't be scared. People want to hear your opinion. We need more people to contribute. You don't have to know all the code in a library in order to make a contribution. If you go to Angular and find an unused variable and delete it and make a pull request, this is helpful. go make meaningful contributions. You don't have to know the whole code. You don't have to know the entire Chromium project in order to make a pull request to V8 and fix something. You don't have to know the entire Angular project to fix something. You don't have to know anything about the project in order to make very localized fixes, and these localized fixes in areas people don't usually approach are very important in the community. Projects today are actively inclusive. In io.js, we want you, and we're willing to work for it. Yeah, people will actually encourage you to write pull requests instead of fixing your issue. If you have a small issue that can be easily fixed, like, I don't understand how something works, they'll actually explain how it works to you and then ask you to write a pull request because we want to get more people involved. So this is Bimper. Bimper is my dog. He's a very cute dog. He's dressed like a bee. But the title is My io.js Story. So I want to tell you about something specific that I did in io.js. But first, let's talk about promises for a second, because I just want to make sure everyone here understands them at a very broad level. So promises are an abstraction over the notion of a time and a value. They're basically a domain-specific language in JavaScript that lets you control a synchronous flow in an easy way. Promises have three possible states. A promise is created. It starts off as pending, which means it's waiting for something. And then it's either fulfilled or rejected. Fulfilled meaning it completed successfully, and rejected means it failed. And a promise is over a value, so if a promise is rejected, the operation failed. If it's exceeded, the value is in the promise. You can extract it with a then. We'll see this soon. And once a promise is resolved, it cannot change state again. If a promise is resolved to the value of 1, it will never resolve to the value of 2. It's immutable. You can count on it. Now, promises chain. It's a very useful aspect of them, and they're throw safe. So in this example, get foo and get bar and get buzz are all async calls. We're calling get foo, getting the promise, returning get bar. We can return a promise from a then, and it will wait for it. This helps us with chaining. I really don't think chaining is the big aspect of promises, but it's nice for syntax. And then we can chain more promises, and there's a global catch here. It will catch any error we have in the chain. It's very useful. It's like a synchronous try-catch. There's very nice modeling between asynchronous exception handling and asynchronous exception handling. And it's really useful. It's a useful construct. Now, promises are easy to aggregate. If you ever needed to get two values together, for a common example in frontend is waiting from the DOM to load and making an AJAX request without having to wait for the entire DOM to load first. So we wait for these two events with a promise.all, and then we start executing our code once we have the model and the DOM is ready. And promises are also native. And this means they are part of ES 2015. There are a lot of people in the committee that deserve a lot of credit for this. There's Dominic, there's Mark, and a bunch of other people who made very big contributions into getting into this stage. They wrote amazing specifications, and props to them. Now, let's talk about the problem with promises. Like I said earlier, promises are throw safe. We have here a J, which I think is an awesome name for JSON, and we're doing a promise.resolve on it. Now, a promise.resolve takes a value and creates a promise for that value. And then we're calling JSON.pras on it. Now, JSON.pras is not a function. It's a typo. In synchronous code, or in normal synchronous code in Node.js, the typical behavior, which I think is insane, is when you throw an error, don't catch it, restart the server. But in this case, it makes sense, because in development time, you'd catch this typo and fix it, and you would have the right code. But in promises, you won't. This chain, I don't know if you can, you can see it. It does not have a catch handler. And when a promise chain does not have a catch handler, it will stay rejected. It will never execute any code that lets you know that a promise rejected. And we have a bunch of other examples here. Here we're calling JSON.parse, but it's an invalid JSON. And then in the third line, which can be a runtime error, it doesn't always have to be something it's an obvious programmer mistake. And here we're causing a nested object. Maybe someone refactored our code in another part of the project and didn't notice this. So these are all swallowed errors, and that's pretty terrible in my opinion. Now, there was this old trick where we had this done method that throws on rejection. And it's nice sugar, but it doesn't really solve the problem, because if you forget this in one place, it's a problem. This is like manual resource management in C. It's not a lot of fun. So like I said, unless we have a catch in our chain, if a step fails after a catch, or you can also pass a catch handler as the second argument of then, nothing happens. We have this server, and it's doing .json to return JSON to our client. And the error is swallowed. The request stays pending, and it's not a lot of fun. So let's talk about me for a second. I participate in the Stack Overflow JavaScript chat. It's a really nice place. There are a bunch of friends here who also, hey, this guy, and some people there, I think. And in 2013, I flew to Finland for a month. I went to Microsoft to work on something there. And I met a fellow user and a friend. His name is Petka. And Petka was very upset. He was like, I don't know if you've ever met an angry Finn, but people from Finland, when they're angry, they're like quiet and very, very angry about something. He was very upset about the performance of promises back then and how hard they were to debug. So this is Petka. This is how he looks. He's a nice guy. He's a big part of our story. And he wrote Bluebird. And Bluebird is a very fast promise library. It's very easy to debug. It does a lot of right stuff, I think. It has a very rich API, and I think everyone should use it. All of you who are not using Bluebird, start using Bluebird. I don't know. And, I personally been a contributor to the Bluebird library with another user called Gorgi since 2013. And 3.0 is coming out with really, really nice features. Check them out soon. But more importantly, Bluebird actually does the right thing in this case. Bluebird has an handled rejection detection. So this is the same code from earlier. We have a deal with bar callback here in the then, and it calls get foo, and maybe there are errors here. We want to know about exceptions. So Bluebird will actually do the same thing. We will tell you, hey, you have an unhandled rejection. At foo failed, at get foo, at deal with bar. It will actually give you the entire asynchronous chain of actions. This is awesome. All it has to do is detect that the promise is rejected, and it has no error handlers. Then it will wait a bit. It's called the microtask. The semantics are not really important right now. And if there's still no error handlers and it's still rejected, report the error. And this is awesome. Bluebird made promises like fun to work with. And suddenly, we don't have unhandled rejections suppressed. So here's an idea. Native promises should be able to do this. There is no reason native promises shouldn't be able to do this sort of stuff. So I had an idea. I wanted to be able to do the following. I wanted to be able to tell the process in Node and IO, hey, if you have an unhandled rejection, deal with it. And if you have a false positive, like a really, really lately attached error handler, I want to deal with that too. So I did some market research. I went through every single library that overrode the default behavior in Bluebird. And I talked to some people. There were very nice people in the promises community, and people were willing to help. This was awesome. So I took my idea, and I made a specification. I made a very simple gist. It's not really in specification format. It doesn't look like the ECMAScript specification. And I talked about the intended behavior. I did some market research. And I talked to a lot of very relevant people in the field. So a lesson I learned from this is communication matters. There are a lot of relevant people in whatever it is you're doing. Maybe not, but in what most of us are doing, there are a lot of relevant people. And talking to them was really important part of what I was doing. So I wrote this really, really long document. I'm not going to go through it with the events and backwards incompatible changes and what other languages do and statistics of other libraries using Bluebird and future work and what the DOM did. And the feedback was really good. And what I mean really good is like, hey, this is Brian. And Brian said, hey, I added this. This feature now works in both Bluebird and When. And the Q library, like Chris was, this sounds like a very nice idea, but I don't have time to deal with it. So I wrote the pull request, I had help, and this was fun. And Paul Irish said, Paul Irish gave a lot of, he gave a lot of really positive and constructive feedback about what to do. And the next thing I did after I wrote the specification and talked to library authors is I opened an issue in Node.js and io.js. Now, the issue of Node.js looked something like this. I went on January 8th and I said, hey, you should consider exposing this. This would solve a real problem for users. And then I went 3 weeks later. Anyone? And then I went like a month later and, hey, would you at least consider backporting this when we land it in IO? In IO just looked like this. Hey, consider exposing the hook. Boom, comment from collaborator on the same day. Boom, another comment from collaborator on the same day. Hey, how does this behave in scenario X? Hey, this is a good idea. We should do this. And people were actually writing, this is Petka again in the bottom, and this is Vladimir, both great people, and not nice idea. Here is an attempt at a pull request for this. It was really amazing, and people were really helpful. Whoa. So we went from the spec to the limitation, and people were stepping up and willing to help. And basically what I had to do is convince Petka to write this because he has a lot more V8 experience than me. I had a stab at it and worked a lot on it together, but I basically wanted to convince him. So remember this guy? I went to him and I told him, hey, we should get this done. And I was sure he was going to say, nah, I don't have time, I'm working full time, and I'm doing this and that. But he was really like, yeah, this is a cool idea, I'm going to write this. So having friends in open source is important. The only reason I got to know Petka was because I went to Stack Overflow chat, and then I flew to Finland. So it was all a very fortunate chain of events. Participation in all these places is what got me to the specification and getting out there. So Petka wrote the pull request with a link to the gist, and there was actually, I'd love to tell you that it went right on the first time, but we actually had an issue with over 400 messages. It was a lot of work, a lot of sleepless nights, a ton of people worked on it. This is just some shouts for people who made a very big contribution to the specification and to the implementation. It was really a big effort, but eventually it landed, and the problem was solved. Now, this is pretty awesome. Now you can take promises in io.js, give them this syntax on unhandled rejection, track it, and you're done. You can now find unhandled unhandled rejections and deal with them. And this was awesome. Now, when I talked to some contributors in the io.js projects about what contribution is, they told me, well, there are a lot of smaller, really meaningful contributions. So just 2 weeks ago, we added something, the late sync IO flag. For those of you who don't know, the model in Node and IO is that you only have a synchronous IO beyond the first tick. You can use like require, which is synchronous IO at the very start. But once your server is up and running, you should only use asynchronous IO. But a lot of libraries were actually violating this. They were making synchronous IO. They were not telling you about this. They were still taking callbacks. So just last week, 2 weeks ago, another user, also a very nice guy, I'm not sure how to pronounce his real name, so I just wrote his alias. He had an idea. He said, like, well, this is stupid. We should just terminate all Node programs that have late I/O. And I thought about it and said, well, that's not practical, but we should have an opt-in idea. We should give you a -- late sync IO flag or something like that, and I proposed it, and we had some discussion about it. It was very interesting, and Trev went on and implemented this. And now you can track synchronous I/O in io.js, which is really useful. It already solved the problem for me in real life. So this was a lot of fun. And this is something any of you who had a bug related to performance in Node and IO can do. It didn't require me to know Node internals. It only required me to be a user of the platform, and that's all it took. Now, I want to give another example. This is FS improvements. The file system model in Node is pretty old. Now, there were a lot of changes, a lot of very nice refactorings by people in the io.js community, but it still needed some tweaking. So this is the user, the fourth eye. He has an Indian name. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it, but he's a really nice guy. I know him from Python. And he basically just went up. I told him about the unhandled rejection hook. He took the FS model and he was like, hey, I can clean this up. So we opened it up. He learned how to clone the project, how to work on it. And he had no prior connection to io.js. He had no prior connection to Node, really. He writes good JavaScript. I know him from I had discussions on him with him on Stack Overflow, but he had no prior connection to io.js. He just opened this up, and he made a few really small changes, and he talked to people in the IRC room, and then he made a few other really small changes. And he basically has 9 pull requests now against IO, and most of them are merged. And he's a really great guy. And I just want to point out, he had no prior experience. It's not like he's a magician in JavaScript. He's not this guy or pretty much everyone sitting in the first line. But he's a really nice guy, and he was able to do this out of pretty much nowhere, which really impressed me. I'm really impressed by just going to the project, opening a random .js file, reading about it, trying it out, and testing it. So you don't have to be an expert in Node.js internals in order to make an important contribution to the process. Now, this can even be like removing stuff from the API. Node.js has an old fs.exists method. It has a different naming convention and calling convention than all the other methods in Node. It does not take an error parameter, which is pretty bad in my opinion. And even taking a method like this and removing it is super important. If you're just angry at something and you want to say, hey, this method is really stupid, removing things from the API is really important. It helps clean things up. Go do it. So A lot of people ask me where to contribute. I want to make contribution, but it's not like projects are actively seeking contributions. How do I start with it? It's not like the biggest projects in JavaScript, the hottest projects are asking for contributions. It's not like I could go to the biggest projects and say, hey, I want to help. And so this is Babel. I don't know how many of you know Babel. All of you who don't know Babel, you should know Babel. It's an awesome project. It works really well. What it does, it takes modern JavaScript and even experimental stuff, and it converts it to ES5. It's written as the first open source project by this guy called Sebastian. He's a really nice person. And he basically opened this issue and said, hey, I want contributors. I want people to help me with the documentation and the website and the internals and cleaning up and performance and all that. So the projects exist out there. If you're someone who says, well, I want to contribute, I want to help, but I don't really know where to start there. Go to Babel. It's an open issue right now. It's number 1347. Go there, contribute. He'd really appreciate it. If you find issues on projects, like I said earlier, in Bluebird, a lot of people don't find these issues but don't report them. Please report them. It's a very big contribution. If you have features you want, I'm repeating myself, this is a great way to start getting involved. If you open an issue in Angular, they'll probably tell you, hey, assuming it's a good issue, they'll say, hey, have a stab at a pull request, and you'll make one, and you get merged, and you're now an Angular contributor. And if you do this enough time, they'll actually invite you to come join them. It's really nice, and this is also true for io.js. Petka, for example, is now working like a big portion of his time on io.js because of that unhanded rejection contribution. So do this. Ask for features you want, open issues, be social. Go on. There's a bunch of channels on IRC for JavaScript and for different frameworks and for different libraries and for different ideas. There's GitHub, obviously, social coding, participating discussions there. Even if you just go to a discussion subject on io.js and say, hey, I'm using this feature you're talking about, but I have this use case you haven't thought of. This is really useful. Answer questions on Stack Overflow. This is really important. A lot of the documentation we find as developers is questions on Stack Overflow. It's a big contribution. Please do this. Be kind. A lot of time people go to projects and there's this very bad feeling that they just want to complain. So complaining is okay, it's good, but be respectful to people who spend their time like building tools you use. If you want to join a mailing list or opening an issue, read a few issues first, read a few emails first, see how the discussion is held. Don't be rude to people, don't call people out names. We're trying as a community, and a lot of different projects are trying to be inclusive. So I ask all of you to lurk before you leap and say hi. We are in conference now. Now, this is pretty awesome that we have such a big JavaScript, and I can speak for the rest of you, but I have had a blast at the first day and at Leah's lecture. So we have this convention. Say hi, meet people, ask people what projects they're working on in this room, and open an issue today. This is my call to action. I want to be super explicit about it. Go to library use, talk about something that bothers you, and open an issue. If you know a bug, chances are that people with the library, they want to know about it. And if you have a feature request, they want to know about it. A lot of people are scared that they're not smart enough to participate in discussions. I'm sure I'm not smart enough to participate in discussions, but I still participate, and it's really nice. Don't be afraid of being talked down to. It's okay. These people, there's a lot of parts where they talk down to each other. It's more friendly than, at least I hope so. And do this. Open an issue today. Go to GitHub. Go to a project you care about. It doesn't have to be on GitHub, but it's practically the only open source, the only source code hosting we use for this sort of stuff. And open an issue. Thank you.